as you trickle in from around the world. We'll just wait till we get a full house, and then we'll start tonight's presentation, which is really exciting. Really delighted that George Wilton is with us tonight. He's done a huge amount of fabulous work on 23 Brigade and their exciting adventures in the Naga Hills in 1944. I'm not going to burst George's bubble. There's an enormous amount of fantastic stuff that he's unearthed for us. Well, we're very pleased to have lots of people joining us from around the world as ever, and you're very welcome tonight if you're listening in as we do this live, or indeed if you're joining us later and watching it on catch up. It's fabulous to have you with us tonight, and a very warm welcome to us, to you from the Kohima Educational Trust. Nice to see some old friends joining. Nick, good to see you. I see you're in your country residence tonight. That's fabulous. And we look forward to seeing some of you joining us in India next week, and then later in the year in November. Yes, and make sure that when you join, you stick all your questions in the chat box. Well, it's time for me to hand over to Sylvia.
And hello everyone, and welcome back to our KET series of webinars. And I have to say, we're starting the new year with a bang, because tonight military historian and author Dr. Robert Lyman is joined by George Wilton, who was inspired so much by hearing Rob speak on Kohima at the Army's Prince Consort Library in Aldershot that he spent the next year or so researching 23 Brigade and has had an article published in the British Journal of Military History. 23 British Infantry Brigade fought in the Naga Hills to the north and east of Kohima, and while a part of Special Force, they were the only long-range penetration unit that did not take part in Operation Thursday, which was the principal Chindit operation in 1944. As a result, 23 Brigade have received scant attention in the historical records and could be called the Forgotten Chindits. Tonight, George plans to put that right. Do feel free to ask questions either on the chat button or the Q&A, which we will endeavour to answer at the end. Should we be unable to, or get round to answering any of your questions tonight, we will follow up by email, and you're always welcome to email any one of us afterwards. So I'm now delighted to hand over to both Rob and George for what promises to be a fascinating talk.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. I'm only going to say a few words by means of introduction before I ask George to take it away. He's going to do all the heavy lifting tonight, which is very exciting for me. In fact, it's becoming a little bit of a habit for me now. I get away with doing a nice little introduction and then sit back and listen to our speakers. I just wanted to say a few words about where my own research a long time ago began with 23 Brigade. And it's good to see tonight a number of children of 23 Brigade veterans joining us. That's very exciting. But some of you will remember the wonderful Philip Brownless, who I was interviewing for a book on Tobruk. And at the end of this, the research and the interviewing for Tobruk, he said, Rob, you know, Tobruk wasn't really up to anything. I need to talk to you about what we did when we hit the Naga Hills. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, we operated behind Japanese lines to the north of Kohima during the Great Battle in 1944. I had absolutely no idea of it. And I went to all of the main the main secondary sources, the published sources on Kohima, and found nothing about 23 Brigade. And a little bit of dabbling in the archives in London made me realize actually there's a whole story here that had never really been told. And I was able to put a chapter in my book, Japan's Last Bid for Victory, and left it at that. And Philip was very pleased. It was an exciting new dimension to the war that really had people had forgotten. Well, I was absolutely delighted when George, a number of years later, decided to pick this up as a specialist area of study. And he's done a very, very excellent article. He produced an excellent article, an academic article on the 23rd Brigade, which I commend to you all. Now, many of you, of course, well, all of you will know about Ord Wingate, and all of you will know about the concept of long-range penetration. Long-range penetration, as Simon Anglin has articulated very clearly, was not invented by Ord Wingate. It was a standard methodology of warfare in the British Army over a long period of time, but Wingate brought it out, dusted it off, and used it in 1943 and 1944. One of the most successful aspects of long-range penetration, of course, was conducted by this brigade, 23 Brigade, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome George to introduce us to the brigade and tell us exactly what they managed to achieve in the Naga Hills in 1944. Over to you, George.
Well, thanks, Rob. First thing I have to do is disagree with Sylvia. It was, I think, 5 years ago, so it was pre-pandemic, that I heard Rob talk at Aldershot, and in one of his throwaway remarks in the Q&A, he said, there were these pile of Chindits over up in the north here, and nobody's looked at them. I thought, oh, well, that sounds interesting. I'll have a look at them. As Rob said, he was the first one to write anything substantial on them. Chapter 6 of his book on Japan's last bid for victory, the invasion of India 44, is probably the most that had been written on the brigade before my sort of trying to fill some of the gaps in. There are a few footnotes in the standard literature, but that's about it, really, which is really surprising when, you know, the Second World War has been pretty well analysed to death. So I sort of looked at them, did some work on them, and then more and more realised that they were the Forgotten Chindits, part of a forgotten army. And here they are. This picture was taken by an RAF photographic unit at Ukhrul towards the end of their operations in July 1944. So let's start off by looking at what a brigade is. I'm going back to basics here. Hope I'm not going to bore you too much with that. A brigade's typically made of 3 battalions. An infantry brigade of the Second World War had 3 battalions. A battalion was around 35 officers, 700 or 800 other ranks. So a brigade was about 2,500 soldiers in bayonet strength. 3 brigades plus the divisional troops made up 70th British Infantry Division. The divisional troops included the headquarters for the brigade, various artillery regiments, Royal Engineers, members of REME, Service Corps, Medical Corps, signals, chaplains, etc. Unusually for British formations in India, 70th Division was an all-British formation. It did not include Indian units as part of its standard complement. The brigade has its origins in the pre-war Canal Brigade, that is Suez Canal, where its role was the protection of the canal. And after 1936, dealing with civil unrest in Palestine after the 36 Arab Revolt. Now, I'm going to talk about the brigade, but I'm also going to talk about the divisional troops who were allocated to it. They normally stayed with the brigade and would fight with them. A purist would say, well, they're not part of the infantry battalions. So where do you draw the line? Well, it's my line, and I'm drawing it, Seaton, to include them. Ooh, screen's frozen. Right, we'll start off with 1st Battalion, the Essex Regiment. It fought in the Sudan against the Italians on the Sudan-Abyssinia border in 1940, interestingly under Slim. It fought to quell the Iraq revolt against the British in 1941. And the Luftwaffe had supported that revolt with planes operating out of Vichy French-controlled Lebanon and Syria. So the next thing the British forces in the Middle East did was occupy Syria and Lebanon, and they fought to do that. It was quite tough fighting. The next battalion I'm going to talk about is the South Staffordshire Regiment, 1st Battalion. Like the 1st Essex, a regular unit. It was in Palestine in 1940, and from 1940-41, it remained in Egypt, in the rear area, rather than actually fighting in the major campaigns of that period. The next unit's 4th Battalion, the Border Regiment. This is a territorial army unit raised in Westmoreland and Cumberland of what is present-day Cumbria. It fought in France in 1940 and was evacuated from Brest. It was part of what was known as the 2nd BEF. It arrived in the Middle East in April 1941 and almost immediately took part in suppressing the Iraq revolt, and again went on to fight in Syria and Lebanon. Now, having said that an infantry brigade has 3 battalions, I'm going to talk about a 4th, which is 2nd Battalion, the Duke of Wellington's regiment. Again, this is a regular unit. It was in India at Peshawar, which is in on the northwest frontier in what is now present-day Pakistan, in 1939. When the Japanese invaded Burma in January 42, it was mobilized out of there and sent to Rangoon. It arrived in Rangoon on the 14th of February and was in contact with the Japanese in fighting on the 22nd. Unfortunately, most of the battalion and nearly all of its equipment was on the wrong side of the Sitang Bridge when that was blown on the 25th of February. The remainder of it, those who were able on the right side of the bridge and those who swam the river, then took part in that long retreat to Imphal, where it arrived in May of 42. It had started with 32 officers and 753 other ranks. There were less than 200 of them by the time it got to Imphal. One of the divisional units that was attached to the brigade was 60th Regiment Royal Artillery. This is a territorial army unit that was raised in Lincolnshire and the North Midlands. They sometimes called themselves the Lincolnshire Gunners. It fought in France in 1940 and was evacuated from Dunkirk. Some of its men took refuge on the beach at Dunkirk on a grounded tug, the Bullfinch, and after helping to refloat it, made their way back to the UK. I think the Bullfinch was actually the idea behind the fishing vessel that's in the film Dunkirk, the Dunkirk 2017 Dunkirk movie. 60RA arrived in Egypt in May 41 and immediately fought with the brigade in Iraq and again in Syria. After Syria, the 2 of the 23 Brigade's infantry battalions, 1st Essex and 4th Border, were part of 70th Division forces that went into Tobruk to replace the Australians. That was in early October. And their war diary says that on a quiet day there, only 240 shells fell on the battalion area, which maybe Mr. Brownlow's comments are worth thinking about. The brigade broke out of Tobruk as part of Operation Crusader, and in late November, 1st Essex was involved in fighting at Ed Duda, where it took pretty heavy casualties. 60RA didn't go into Tobruk. Instead, the gunners joined the 7th Armoured Division support group, and they fought with that support group at Sidi Rezeg on 23rd of November. A VC was won there by the support group's commander, Jock Campbell, Royal Horse Artillery, and the support group was overrun by German Afrika Korps, and 60RA lost 14 of its 24 guns, something that gunners are very reluctant to lose. In December 41, the entire brigade is moved out of the line to Syria and Lebanon to refit and recover. In February, 26th of February, well, earlier in February, but on the 26th of February, the division leaves Suez for Rangoon. Some of them on the Mauritania, some of them on the Orontes, but it's clear that they're not going to get to Rangoon in time because it was abandoned on the 7th of March. The division, less one brigade that went to Ceylon, arrived in Bombay on the 10th of March, and then moved across country by road and rail, most of them by rail, the gunners by road, and were then held for the next, I guess, sort of year and a bit as a reserve force near Calcutta as a strategic reserve. They were involved in aid to the civil power and quite a lot of jungle training. have to remember that 42-43 was the period of the Quit India campaign and also the Bengal famine, which is the area that the division was based. 23 Brigade was moved to Arakan in April 43 to provide a backstop after the failure of the 43 Arakan offensive. And the idea was if the Japanese broke through, they'd stop them getting any further. They actually had no contact with the Japanese at all and returned to India. Let's have a look at the composition of the brigade from the period of about March 42 to September 43. These numbers are taken from the various war diaries, and you can see that we have about 3,300 in the brigade as a whole, including 60th Regiment RA and 12th Field Company Royal Engineers, plus all of the medical corps and etc. within the numbers. You can see what they were doing on the right-hand side in that period. Slim visited the division in August 42 and commented, "It was one of the best British formations I've met, with a magnificent battle-hardened spirit gained in the Middle East." Now, the division had only been in India 5 months by that time. A year later, we see one of the gunners of 60 RA writing, "All we were doing was playing soldiers." So you can see very different opinions in the period of just over a year. Long-range penetration concept. I've written the concept was developed by Ord Wingate, which Rob is quite right in saying LRP is as old as the hills. In fact, you can go back to the fighting between Athens and Sparta to look at LRP if you want. The unique thing that Wingate realized was that you could support the troops by air. I think he deserves some credit for that at least. His idea was that you'd have mobile columns that would operate deep behind the lines to disrupt the communications of an enemy and draw reserves away from conventional fighting elsewhere. So it was seen as a support operation to an offensive. He advocated columns of around 300 to 400, which used mules to support them, but nevertheless, the Chindits carried very heavy backpacks, 60 to 70 pounds each. The first Operation Longcloth, was a brigade-sized operation, sized at about 3,000 people. It took place between February and late April 43. They marched across, they crossed the Chinwin in a couple of places, and then the columns marched into Burma, where they blew up bridges and railway lines. Some of the columns even crossed the Irrawaddy, but they were quickly hunted down by the Japanese in what was relatively open country. They weren't in jungle. Sadly, only 1 in 3 of those columns survived that fighting or Japanese captivity. Longcloth was a very costly operation with around 27% dead and missing, primarily because there was no provision made for evacuating sick or wounded. They were left behind for the Japanese to deal with. Nevertheless, Longcloth was seen as a bright spot in an otherwise rather dismal 1943 after the failure of the Arakan offensive. It was seen as having proved the viability of the LRP concept in that British troops could be put into the jungle, could face the Japanese, and could deal with them. And it came as, I guess, a bright spot after the unremitting bad news of defeat in Malaya in Burma in 42, and again the Arakan offensive in 43. Also has to be said that Wingate was very good at promoting himself and his ideas. As a result of that, he was able to convince Churchill and the Combined Chiefs of Staff to carry out a much larger operation in 1944. Now, on the left-hand side, we see the Chinth, which is the symbol that was worn as the shoulder flash by the brigade, or by the division, I should say, or later on Special Force, which is a stylized version of the Shinzei figure that's a lion like a guardian of Buddhist temples. His idea was that attacks and grand ambushes by combining columns would create forces big enough to do more than hit and run, which was pretty much the nature of Longcloth. But when they were faced with superior Japanese forces, they would be able to disperse into the jungle and melt away. This was a much larger operation than Longcloth. It had about 17,000 Chindits in it. One of the things they did was they built strongholds. Now, essentially, this was an airborne operation with around 14,000 Chindits flown into stronghold airstrips that had been established by glider-borne Chindits and US Army engineers, unbelievably, with small bulldozers that were taken in the gliders. They created airstrips that were big enough to take C-47 DC-3 Dakotas. So most of the guys were flown in transport aircraft with their mules, with all of their equipment and with everything else. And then a few of the strongholds were retained and fortified to provide a base for flying in people or reinforcements for evacuating casualties. Some of them were quite substantial. What they typically had 3 or 4 25-pounder anti-aircraft guns, some Bofors 40mm anti-aircraft guns. At one stage, they were even operating 6 Spitfires from one of the runways. They had a radar station in place as well, but that was not typical. That was one of the bigger ones. Interestingly, Thursday's primary air support came from the Americans in the form of the US Army Air Corps' first Air Commando, but there was considerable RAF support to the Air Commando. The intent of the strongholds was that they would be remote enough to be defended by, if you like, a garrison, as well as by floater columns that would be operating outside of the fence and would attack the back of the Japanese forces attacking them. One of the brigades did actually march into Burma. That was 14 Brigade under Ferguson, which marched into Lado. The 16 Brigade, I should say, which marched into Lado, and on arrival immediately attacked the town of Indore to try and secure the airstrip. The operation failed, and the men, who were completely exhausted by then, were flown out not much longer. Wingate died in an air crash on March 24th, and one of his brigade commanders, Joe Lentane, took over. This was a controversial decision, as are most things about the Chindits, Wingate in particular. Operation Thursday lasted from the 5th of February 43, when 77th Brigade began its march in, to 27th of August, when the last Chindits were flown out. On the left, in the small picture, we see Brigadier Mike Calvert at Mogung in northeastern Burma. And facing us, looking very cool with the carbine over his arm, is Major James Lumley. He led one of the Gurkha columns. His daughter, Joanna, is probably better known now as the campaigner on behalf of Gurkha welfare issues. 23 Brigade was trained to take part in this operation and was about to fly in when Slim deflected it, is the term that's used, to the Naga Hills, but more about that in a minute. This was the composition of the brigade as an LRP formation. At the time, the announcement was made that 70th British Infantry Division was going to be broken up and become part of the Special Force. And what we see is we have 8 fighting columns and a rear and field HQ. The rear HQ was in India, the field column was out in the field, and we have about 3,400 men here. Notably, 1st South Staffordshire's left for Special Forces 77th Indian Brigade under Mike Calvert and took part in Operation Thursday, and was replaced by the 2nd Duke of Wellington's regiment. Now, the reason for that was that its colonel, Colonel Faithful, had lobbied very hard for a special force role for his unit, arguing that it had a score to settle after the losses it had taken on the retreat to Imphal. The other thing to note is that the Royal Artillery numbers were actually lower than that when it actually became an LRP, because the specialist artillerymen were transferred out to other gunner units. To make up the numbers for 60RA, a number of men were drafted back to it, some from 4th Borders and some, about 112 also, from the South Staffs. Something I found out quite recently was that the column numbering for the 3 infantry battalions, it reflects there once being regiments of foot. For example, the Essex Regiment, which was formed in 1881 from the amalgamation of the 44th and 56th regiments of foot. And you see us say the same again for the other units. It's one of the reasons why the column numbers are so random within Special Force. With 60RA, you can understand why 60 column would be chosen. Where 88 comes from, I have no idea. Talk about leadership of 23 Brigade. Well, the first thing to say is, what a mustache that is. It's a belter. The brigade was led by Lancelot Connop Edgar Perrone, Lance Perrone. He was at Woolwich. He's an engineer, Royal Engineer. He trained at Woolwich with Wingate and Bernard Tulloch, who I'll talk about later. He was in France in 1940 when the Germans broke through, and he formed an ad hoc unit called Perrone's Rifles in May, gathering up soldiers from all over the place. And they constructed various backstop positions in the attempt to delay the advance of the Germans, and was partly involved in work that secured the perimeter around Dunkirk. They actually were evacuated from Le Havre in May 1940. What he did between May 1940 and 1943 is a bit mysterious. He was an anti-aircraft and searchlight specialist before the war. I've reason to believe that he was probably an army commando for a while, but I haven't got any firm record on that. If anybody could put the Perrone family in touch with me, I really would like to learn more about him. He, as you'll see later, he was a fiery and motivated commander. In his order of the day to the column commanders before they went into the Naga Hills in April 44, he said, "Our task remains as it was, to exterminate the Japanese vermin in our path." So interesting remarks from a guy who comes from a family of churchmen and diplomats. In fact, his brother became the padre to the Chindits later on. And in fact, he and his brother had dinner together during the retreat to Dunkirk. Very interesting character. Now, the reason he was replaced was that the existing brigadier, Brigadier Marindin, was 43 years old, and Wingate was unprepared to have anybody in the special force who was over 40. So what you then see is quite a number of changes going through the leadership of 70th Division as a whole. If we look at 23 Brigade's battalion leaders, we have Marindin, who was replaced by Perrone, and then you can see in yellow the guys who were replaced before the operation. Faithful was actually replaced, I think, in March of 44. His deputy, Stevens, took over in the field in the hills. Perrone wasn't happy with the performance of 2DWR and replaced him immediately afterwards with a guy called Dalrymple, who later went to become the regimental colonel. 4th Borders, the TA unit, was the only one that maintained its lieutenant colonel all the way through. Let's talk a little bit about 60RA's colonel. He was a regular army gunner, Lieutenant Colonel Peel. He was not happy with the idea of his gunners becoming Chindits, so he took himself off to Delhi to lobby against that happening. And by the time he got back to his field regiment, he found he'd already been replaced. He was replaced by Lieutenant Colonel H.G. Mike de Jacobi du Vallon. They seem to specialize in rather good names within this group. Said to be an LRP specialist, although I can find no reason why. He led 60 column, and 88 column was led by his deputy, Major Hodgkin, who I'll talk about later. The superb graphic on the left was produced by a guy called Alf Sampson. Alf was a pre-war commercial artist, and his work has been published in a book called Bless 'Em All. It's long out of print, but if you can get a copy, it's well worth buying. Because of his ability with drawing and with maps, he was a member of the headquarters column intelligence section. Confusingly, he was a member of the Durham Light Infantry, but there we go. The selection process involved, first of all, rejecting all men over 40 who were returned to unit, which meant they were assigned to other units somewhere in India. They also faced a very rigorous medical. Anybody who failed that was again bounced out. They then went through a period of intense physical training with very long marches, carrying heavy loads, with water discipline, and often on restricted rations. And this was carried out in the Sogor area of central India, with an emphasis on fitness, crossing rivers, jungle concealment, ambushes, and animal handling. I mentioned mules. The 23 Brigade received its mules in about October, November of 1943. Anybody who couldn't keep up with the pace of training was bounced out. Worth noting that Special Force training was independent of the retraining schemes that were underway elsewhere for 14th Army. There's actually a very good paper on that in the British Journal for Military History. What did a column look like? Well, this is based on column 84, which is a Yorkshire Lancs column from Tony Redding's book, War in the Wilderness. And what I've done is I've tweaked it to show what I think a 23 Brigade column would look like. Principal differences with the Thursday columns are that you had a reconnaissance platoon that came from the Assam Rifles rather than the Burma Rifles for the Thursday guys. Plus, there were a group of V-Force Naga scouts and interpreters, typically about 60 to 70 who were attached. A commando platoon, which was made up of the Royal Engineers, rifle company, and a support weapons platoon, an animal section with just under 80 people to look after the round about 120 mules and ponies. Notably, an RAF section of an officer and 2 sergeants, their job was to call in the supply drops and also to decide where airstrips should be built, and also to call in direct air support by Hurricane fighter bombers when it was needed. What I want to do here with this table is indicate how weakly armed a Chindit column was. Now, if we go back to an earlier slide, we saw that an infantry battalion was used to generate 2 columns. But an infantry battalion at that time typically had 6 3-inch mortars. 2 columns had 4, no 2-inch mortars, etc. And what you can see is that the Chindit columns had a lot less firepower than they did as an infantry battalion. Now, arguably, they didn't need the 6-pounder anti-tank guns, as there weren't any of those in the Naga Hills. Piats were a shaped charge, shoulder-launched anti-tank weapon. They had a few of those, and they actually took them with them, and they were used not against tanks, but against bunkers. And in addition to that, 23 Brigade also previously had 24, 25-pounder guns, and those had been given up and gone when 60 RA was turned into infantry. Let's look now at the Nagas and the Naga Hills. This quote comes out of the headquarters war diary. The country to be crossed by the columns during their march comprised a tumble mass of jungle rising sheer out of the plains to an average height of 4,000 to 6,000 feet. Geologically, they resembled nothing more than a crumpled, starched tablecloth. though the grain of the country lies generally north to south. I think it's a very good description. I haven't been, but I'm hoping to go this November. Again, from the war diary, the Nagas displayed throughout the most unswerving loyalty and could be trusted thoroughly as guides and informers. Without them, it would have been impossible. Now, Flying Officer Jackson. His is an amazing story. Maybe try to get Rob to talk about this. He was a Hurricane pilot who crashed in Burma to the south of Jessamy on the 22nd of March, 1944, and made his way north. And he met some Nagas who over the next month fed him, hid him, and passed him on, eventually to V-Force, and then finally to 2nd Dukes near Kohima on the 16th of April. Sylvia May recently told me that Ray later supported the building of a basketball court at Fakakedzumi, village that had hidden him. I want to talk very briefly also. The Nagas did betray some Chindit ambushes to the Japanese, although later on it was found that this had occurred when the Japanese had coerced Nagas to being their porters. So what they did was prevent their own men being shot up in a Chindit ambush. Some of the other hill groups nearer to Kohima and Ukhrul were not as loyal as the Nagas were. As Brits, I guess we're kind of used to Network Rail telling us about the wrong sort of leaves on our railway tracks. 23 Brigade faced a bigger problem in the Naga Hills. It was the wrong sort of jungle. Now, why was that? Well, a Chindit column would have been an unusual sight. Typically, it was about half a mile long, and it progressed in absolute silence. And even the mules were silent because their vocal cords had been cut. The men communicated only in whispers, often even in whispers at the nightly bivouac. And they often had no fires to either heat water or to heat their food. The mules carried the bulky radio sets and their petrol engine driven battery chargers, medical equipment, the mortars, the machine guns, etc. It quickly became apparent when the Chindits got up into the Naga Hills that the 23 Brigade columns couldn't operate in the way they'd been trained, which was for larger scale operation in relatively flat and open forest rather than jungle hills, where they could strike and then disappear. A good example of that is the impossibility in the hills of using the standard Chindit bivouac procedure. With no flat ground off the tracks, the column could not stop, turn 90 degrees in single file, and then move 400 yards, stop, turn another 90 degrees, move another 400 yards, stop, etc. And finally, bivouac. So they've covered all of their tracks. Basically, you went off the track in the Naga Hills, there was nowhere to go. So instead, the columns used the Naga villages as bases from which they sent out patrols on reconnaissance or larger groups to ambush Japanese patrols or attack Japanese occupied villages. In reality, the 8 fighting columns operated as 4 battalions, plus the small brigade HQ. So it's quite different to Thursday, where you can actually track individual columns. Here, they were spread out over quite a big area. 3 small strongholds were built, one at Norwich, one called Norwich, near Mariani, which I'll show in a minute. Grimsby near Fakakedzumi, which was attacked by the Japanese and was then abandoned, and Grimsby 2, which is near Nungfung. But these were nothing like the ones on Thursday. They were only suitable for airdrops and light aircraft operations. They did build 6 light aircraft strips of about 300 meters length. February, March 1944, quite a busy slide here. Probably most of this will be familiar to you, but it's important we realize why Slim, the commander of 14th Army and of Special Force, took the decision to deflect 23 and 14 brigades away from Thursday. In early 1944, there was a lot of uncertainty because they knew that the Japanese were going to do something but they didn't know where. 24th of March, Wingate dies in an air crash. On the 5th of February, the Japanese began their Hargo offensive in the Arakan. At that stage, nobody knew whether it was diversionary, which we now know it was, or was the primary. That ended more or less with the Battle of the Admin Box on the 24th of March, although fighting carried on there for some time afterwards. On the 6th of March, the Japanese began their primary offensive towards Imphal. 6th of July, they begin the retreat from Imphal. So you can see why Slim is quite uncertain as to what's going on at that time. Looking now at Kohima in February and March 44, 3rd of April, the Japanese isolate Kohima and the siege phase begins. 3rd to the 10th of April, 23 Brigade arrives at Mariani, where its role was to guard the railway. This was the railway to Lado, which was the end of the railway and one of the principal places for supplying the hump, which was the airlift, American airlift of supplies to Chinese forces in China. They built a stronghold near Mariani and near Mariani called Norwich. It was pretty well abandoned once the guys went up into the hills. Between the 7th and the 10th of April, 2 columns leave for the Naga Hills, and they're all in the hills by the 22nd. 20th of April, the Kohima siege phase ends when I think it was the Punjabis who got through first, and that's followed up by the long counterattack afterwards. So what you see here is that 23 Brigade didn't actually get into the hills until the primary fighting, the siege phase, was over. Let's look at a timeline for the brigade now. So I said that 2 columns left for the hills in April. 20th of April, 33 Indian Infantry Brigade arrives at Mariani and relieves 23 Brigade. 4th of June, we see the general retreat from Kohima. And 25th of April, initial contact is made by 1st Essex with Japanese near Fakekekrima, which I understand today is called Fek. Now I'm going to say here that I'm going to use the names that are in the war diaries rather than any more modern Indian nomenclature for places. 26th, 27th of April, the monsoon breaks and continues all the way through operations until the end of July. Excuse me. On the 7th of June, orders were given by Slim for all to Ukral, which was basically for 23 Brigade to chase the retreating Japanese as they retreated away from Kohima. So what we see after that date is the columns beginning to move south. 22nd of July, the columns begin to meet British forces advancing from Kohima and Imphal in the Ukral area. A map always helps. Unfortunately, the map on the left, which is in the war diaries, it's a great map, but it's very difficult to read. So I've produced a schematic on the right. It has some errors in it, but it's, I think, good enough for our purposes here. The war diaries talk about the operation having 4 phases. First of all, the approach march, which was from Mariani into the hills. Then what they call the period of ambushes in the initial operating area, and that's contained within the red ellipse that you see there. And then after that, the pursuit. And what we see there is different arrows. On the right-hand side, we see 1st Essex and 60 RA, 60 Royal Artillery, going down on an easterly route, kicking off from Jessamy, and going down through the Somra tracts, where they actually reached an altitude of almost 8,000 feet. And they passed through what they called the Valley of Death, which was an area of knee-high and thigh-high mud in the monsoon that was full of Japanese dead, Japanese mules, as well as skeletons from the 1942 retreat. They then went down to Fort Keary and then swung towards the west to cut off the Japanese who were retreating to Ukhrul in that direction. 2 weeks later, 4th Borders and 2nd Dukes were ordered to move south. They were held initially to maintain security of the flank of Kohima. They went through the pursuit on a more or less a direct southerly route. And again, they went down to Ukhrul. 32, the brigade headquarters column in the field came down more or less through the middle. Having operated in the Ukhrul area, mopping up survivors for a period, that was followed by the withdrawal, which it was by road to Imphal and Dimapur, and then eventually by rail. The operations in overview. Well, initial contact was made on the 25th of April near Fakir-Krima. There were about 89 contacts between the brigade and the Japanese. And I will say here that it wasn't just the Japanese, it was also members of the Indian National Army who were ex-Indian Army who'd been prisoners of war. The Japanese had recruited to fight with themselves. Most of these contacts were small, and I've included within it things like people sniping for a couple of days. Some of them are larger ambushes, of course, but we don't see anything major here in the way of columns combining as they did on Thursday to attack Mogung or Myitkyina or something like that. These were small patrol type actions by platoons, or probably at the most 200 men in the attacks on some of the Japanese occupied villages. They attacked 5 villages that I'm aware of. All of these attacks were unsuccessful, despite fighter bomber support from the RAF. The Japanese were pretty well dug in at these locations. And after the initial air attacks, the Japanese wised up pretty quickly. And instead of staying in their bunkers in the villages, they actually moved off into the jungle on one side during the air attacks and then moved back in afterwards. The Brigade War Diary talks about some 800 Japanese Indian National Army guys being killed. Talk a little bit about supply drops. The thing that Wingate twigged early was that you could marry the idea of operating behind an enemy's front line, which was not new, by supplying in by air, which was relatively new, although air supply was even done during the First World War. The RAF provided the air support for the 23 Brigade from these squadrons, using C-47s, DC-3s. They lost 3 and about 21 crew. Each of the columns had, as I said earlier, a RAF officer and 2 sergeants and their radios to call in the supply drops. This picture is one that Rob had managed to obtain from the RAF unit at Ukhrul. So it gives a rather false idea of flat ground, which there is at Ukhrul, but not in the hills. They flew some 700-800 sorties, about 8 a day. 6,500 pounds, and their success rate was about 70% in the hills, either dropping on the strongholds or on Naga villages. That dropped to about 40% when the Chindits were in the pursuit phase and there were no villages and they were in close jungle, often in the valley bottoms during the monsoon when the pilots couldn't see them. This marvelous sketch on the right again comes from Alf Sampson. During this period, there was a new form of injury developed, or description developed, called KFF, which was killed by flying fruit, after one Chindit was killed by a free drop of cased pineapple tins. So the idea that the supply drops were not hazardous is far from the truth. They certainly were. Direct air support came from the RAF. Now, this was quite different to the type of air support that was going on at this time in Northwest Europe, where you had ranks of Orca typhoons in the area who would, famously come in on purple smoke and deal with German artillery, whatever. It typically took 3 days to arrange a direct air support sortie. Again, provided all by the RAF. You can see the armament of the Hurricanes here. On Kohima, there were 4 attacks, each by 6 aircraft, 3 by 6 on Narama and 3+ on Ukrul. So the RAF gave the Naga villages a pretty good beating, shooting them up and bombing them. I mentioned on Operation Longcloth that there was a very high casualty rate because there was no way of getting the sick and wounded out. Well, for Operation Thursday and the 23 Brigade, the Americans had Stinson L1 Sentinels and L5 Vigilants, which are light aircraft. One of them could carry 1, and I think the other could carry 2 stretcher cases. And they were operated right through the period of 23 Brigade's time in the Naga Hills. They were withdrawn in June. I'm not quite sure why, but I think it was to do with Stilwell. They carried out supply drops and Kazivacs from the stick strips. What would typically happen was the wounded would be carried back, or sick, would be carried back to Mokuk Chung or to Nungfung by Naga porters. Sometimes it took 5 to 10 days to get the guys back, and sadly a number of the wounded died en route. And from there they were taken back to Norwich, Mariani and Norwich, using ambulance jeeps that the brigade had managed to scrounge. The Stinsons also dropped silver rupees for Naga tribesmen who were involved in building airstrips and roads in the hills. Unlike the Japanese, they also paid for any food that the Nagas could supply, although they had precious little themselves. And they were also quite clever in being able to pick up messages that were being strung on a rope between 2 bamboo poles, so they're able to get captured documents back and things like that. Nutrition. There's a great quote in the war diary which says nutrition was seen as truly bad. And it resulted in much sickness and resulted in the weakening of the soldiers. And I think you can see that in the photograph below. I mean, these were very fit men when they went into the jungle in April, and you can see their ribs pretty much there. Now, the reason for that was their use of K rations. It was American K rations. These have been designed for use by airborne troops and tank crews for short periods, certainly not for 3 or 4 months operation. The fundamental problem was it just didn't have enough calories in them. And you can see that there, the 6,000 calorie estimate comes from the brigade medical officer. Initially, an outbreak of diarrhea and stomach cramps was put down to the K rations. In fact, it was called K rationitis, but it wasn't. The Naga Hills water has a lot of magnesium sulfate in it, Epsom salts, which resulted in diarrhea, etc. As the men got weaker, we see an increasing incidence of malaria and later typhus. At one stage, 120 men of 60 RA were down with malaria. And during the pursuit phase, 5 guys from 1st Essex died of typhus in a couple of days. No way of getting them back, to hospital in time. What happened after the withdrawal? Well, when they got back to India, they were given 4 weeks of blanket treatment, which was basically bed rest. They were then offered a 4-week R&R period, but very few wanted it. They were still too weak. Many of the men remained permanently unfit for further soldiering in terms of fighting. Plaudits were received from Mountbatten, Slim, Stopford, and Perone. Stopford stated in his that 23 Brigade actions resulted in no Japanese supplies reaching Kohima, was the major factor in the Japanese withdrawal, and he was wrong. The reason the Japanese withdrew from Kohima and Imphal, and Rob has written on this, was they're being beaten by a superior modern all-arms force with air support, which had been trained how to fight and win against the Japanese. Poor Japanese logistics and the lack of food from the Naga Hills foraging attempts helped in that, but they weren't decisive. By late 1944, an operation called Python was underway, which called for the repatriation of all men who had 44 months or more overseas service. So what we do see in the back end of 44 after the operation is a massive outflow of troops back to Europe. It was so bad for 60 RA, who numbered only about 200 after that, that the unit went into suspended animation. In fact, it was never reformed after the war and was disbanded in 47. Special Force was stood down in February 1945. There had been some talk about using it as an air landing or glider-borne force for an invasion that year, but that was decided they weren't needed. Interestingly, 2nd Dukes did get back to Burma in 1945. There were only about 200 of them because of Python. They were there in an anti-dacoit role, securing road transport in the outskirts of Rangoon. Someone who did stay on in India was Major Hodgkin of 60 RA, who I've talked about earlier, and who led 88 Column. He'd been a first-class cricketer before the war, and for the golfers amongst us, the difficult Hodgkin course at Woodhall Spa is named for him. It's built on what was family land. Now, the reason he stayed on in India wasn't to serve with 60 RA. He took part in a cricket tour with Dennis Compton. And in 1946, he played county cricket in the UK for Middlesex. After the war, he returned to the family business of stockbroking. Perowne went on to become a Major General, commanded the 17th Gurkha Division during the Malaya emergency, and the Brigade of Gurkhas eventually before retiring in 1982. Sylvie Mays told me that the Perowne family have been long-term supporters of the trust. Briefly, I want to talk about losses. I need to move on a bit. There's lots of inconsistency in the data. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but the war diaries would indicate that there were about 74 dead and missing. But if I use the Commonwealth War Graves Commission data, I get about 140. So that's a 2 to 4% death and missing rate. The wounded I get from war diary data, 111. If you add up what's in the individual war diaries, you only get about 88. Evacuated sick, pretty good number, 272. So fairly high casualty rate for the operation as a whole of about 13 to 15%. Operation Thursday overall was about 52%, to give you an idea. So 23 Brigade got relatively lightly. In dead and missing terms, you can really see the impact of the light aircraft and the medevac on Thursday. I'm also going to draw your attention to South Staffs here. They fought in two of the toughest engagements in Operation Thursday, and their dead and missing rate was about twice that of Operation Thursday as an average. They'd have got away a lot more likely if they'd stayed with 23 Brigade in the Naga Hills. The brigade was kind of lucky, actually, because Wingate had planned to deploy 23 Brigade to a place called Pakoku, which is near Mandalay, on a railway bridge in the same sort of country where the Longcloth columns were carved up in 1943. After his death, that idea died with him, fortunately. So, sort of trying to bring this to an end, was it all worth it? Well, for me, it's not an LRP operation. It wasn't deep. It wasn't particularly behind enemy lines. Arguably, it did support a British offensive through Kohima. Short-range penetration. This was an operation by troops in the mountains. The Chindits were never able to overcome dug-in Japanese at Whakakekrima near Nerima, etc. And that was basically because they just weren't heavily armed enough. And it took field, medium artillery and tanks at Kohima to do that. So these guys had no chance. They did inhibit Japanese foraging for food and any movement west in the Naga Hills, though in fairness, the Japanese never really made a determined attempt. The brigade was not able to move east of Jessamy for a grand ambush until after the Japanese had gone. The pursuit started really about 2 weeks too late, and by that I mean 60 RA and 1st Essex leaving Nung Fung should have started earlier. Controversially, I'm now going to say that, like Operation Thursday, this was a waste of scarce British troops. And like Operation Thursday, 23 Brigade was finished as a fighting unit afterwards. Now, I'm going to draw a parallel quickly here. There was another British division in India, 2nd British Division, which also had a North African pedigree and arrived in India in mid-42, and again was held in strategic reserve, but this time near Mumbai. It never converted to the LRP role, and it was the lead division in the relief and counter-attack at Kohima, and it then in 1945 took part in Slim's crushing victory of the Japanese in Burma in 45. Now that was something that 23 Brigade and Special Force and its remnants was completely incapable of doing afterwards. I agree with Slim and others that converting 70th Division to LRP was an error of strategic judgment. I'd even go further. Wingate, with Churchill behind him, did a better job of destroying British forces than the Japanese did in 1943 and 1944. But none of that detracts from the Chindits as soldiers. They were magnificent, highly trained, highly motivated warriors who showed the way of fighting in a new way under extreme adversity. Sadly, they were used in the wrong way and at too large a scale on Thursday. Finally, I have these words which come from one of the war diaries. They come from an address made by the pastor of Toloi at Ukrul in August 44. The 4 dreadful months of Japanese occupation has passed. It was a time when fear ruled our minds and everybody awaited death. It was a time when the enemy was everywhere. There was no path on which they'd not trodden. They took away all our foodstuffs repeatedly. Now trembling has turned into leaping for joy. Now every man is free to do what he likes. Couple of things here. First of all, this pastor was not entirely Christian in his thoughts. Later on in his sermon, he takes a really pointed criticism at various other non-Naga groups for helping the Japanese. But looked at from any perspective, the Nagas were decidedly unlucky in having someone else's war fought in their hills. From a British perspective, the Nagas were magnificent, despite the RAF bombing of their villages and the Japanese theft of their food. And so there we have it, the story of the 23rd British Infantry Brigade in the Naga Hills. And I hope that the next time you hear of Chindits or Operations Longcloth or Thursday or even of Wingate, that you remember 23 Brigade as well, the Forgotten Chindits.
Oh, that was fantastic, George. Thank you very, very much indeed. And what a brilliant overview. And I know that many of our audience this evening will relate so much to what happened with their fathers and grandfathers and will know more about what they did tonight. And Rob, do you want to take any questions?
Well, I really just want to thank George for an outstanding talk and presentation tonight. And no, I'm very, very pleased. Any new research into this fascinating subject is to be welcomed, and particularly one that applies such strong and intelligent analysis to the issue. That debate around the Chindits is a difficult one, but it has to be said. And we need to just to remember that the decision that led to the breakup of the wonderful 70th Division, which had fought through most of the siege of Tobruk, was a political decision, not really a military one. It was designed to persuade Roosevelt that Britain was capable and interested in invading Burma in order to be able to carry out the ends of Allied strategy. But of course, political determination often leads to, issues that we might regret in terms of our army. And I think anyone associated with the 7th Division always regretted it. Certainly its GOC, General Officer Commanding George Symes, was bitterly upset by the decision, and Slim's on record of coming along and putting his arm around his shoulder and saying, there's nothing we could do about it, old boy. You know, you've lost your division. This is a decision which has been taken in London way above your or my pay grade. But I really appreciate the analysis. I think the judgments you've come to, George, are sensible and sound. Now, there are lots of questions coming through. I've answered one of them, or not questions, there are lots of comments. I don't think there are many questions itself. So I think unless there is anything specific from anybody, we'll just hand back to Sylvia. If you've got anything you want to ask me or ask George in particular, then you know where to find us, email us, and I'll put it in the chat and we'll make sure we get a response back to you. Sylvia.
And thanks, Rob. And I was going to say that any of you listening tonight, if you have any more information about your relatives who were there, I know that George would be very keen to hear from you and very happy to receive emails. You can send them through me if you would like to, or get in touch, whichever way. Well, that just leaves me to thank all of you for joining and to remind you about our KET shop, where, as you know, you can buy the whole range of Rob Lyman's books, and remind you that every sale means that 50% of the cover price goes straight to KET. Our next webinar is on Thursday, March 23rd, when Steve Snelling will be making a return visit. Evening, Steve. I think you're joining us tonight, and will be guiding us through the events that occurred on Hill 170. Until then, very good night to you all. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.